the fall of 2011 class and stuff. And those people are not interested anymore. But here, so we looked at this, but I saw that. Wait, these we already looked at, and I'm going to skip over some of these. Basically, I just threw some of these together. Actually, I sat in for somebody's logic course over the summer and took some of these that I had used. But look at, these are cut and pasted from a number of different things. I've used these in the past. When I used Kofi, I had to search for my own fallacy examples, and because basically he didn't have much to test that. But here was an argument. These are two examples of a type of indirect fallacy argument that's called the bandwagon argument. And it's used a lot in advertising. But the first quote was from the use of it. I sort of paraphrased the discussion that was going on when they were trying to sell Obamacare. One of the arguments that was used, or part of what was given as a justification for why we ought to have it, was a bandwagon argument. A bandwagon argument basically appeals to somebody's desire to associate with a particular group. It basically it says, hey, look, jump on the bandwagon too. All these people have done it, or have bought product X. So jump on the bandwagon, you buy product X as well. Right, in other words, join all these people. And this, before looking at the healthcare one, this is such an obvious example of this. And by the way, Mavis teaches typing is actually a pretty good program. But the point is we're evaluating an argument, and it is good software, and there are a number of reasons somebody could give that would give you good logical reasons to buy the program. But this argument just says, hey, a lot of people are using it, so why don't you? No, Mavis Speaking teaches typing can help you type better and be more productive. I got this right off. You can see an ad. This is from the distant archives. More than 2 million users are already better typists and big fans of Mavis. Again, look for Mavis at computer stores everywhere. You see, and back then most people, bought software in a box, downloaded it. But you can see the argument, right? It says, hey, a lot of people are already using product X, so jump on the bandwagon, you do it. Well, just because a lot of people are doing something, it doesn't mean that the conclusion is true that you ought to as well. And so this is generally considered a fallacy of irrelevance, But it's a specific one that gets labeled a bandwagon argument. But look at this one. And this is my summary, but this is basically the argument that was going around that a lot of people were spouting on in this case on the internet, but also on the television. The following argument supporting government-run healthcare, socialized medicine, appeared recently on the internet. Well, recently, 2 or 3 years most of the industrialized nations of the world have some form of government-run health care, or called socialized medicine. Therefore, conclusion, the United States should join them, pass comprehensive health care reform legislation, i.e. Obamacare, and also adopt a form of socialized medicine. So saying, hey, all these countries are doing it, so we ought to as well. It's a bandwagon argument, And of course, a lot of these countries' economies are tanking right now, in part because of this. But at any rate, so it's not a good. In other words, this reason for why we ought to have it is just not it's not a good argument. Yes.
So pretty much you're saying, even though some argument may be better, the conclusion of it means that it's not true.
What we're saying is the argument, when you say to some the argument may be valid, well, the argument, and at best it would be only an inductive argument. But what we're saying is, if the argument commits a fallacy of relevance, the premise, even if it's true that all these countries have adopted some form of socialized medicine, what we're saying is, even if true, the premise does not support the conclusion, either inductively or deductively. So it commits a fallacy. It has no connection with whether the conclusion is true or not, that all these people have bought into it. Okay. So what we're saying is, this is not a good reason for why somebody should buy it. But remember, we said what makes these fallacies though so widespread is they are psychologically persuasive. That's why people in advertising use these types of arguments, because whether or not they work logically, they tend to work psychologically. But part of what we're trying to get to do in logic class is try to evaluate an argument on the basis of actual reasons that are given, and whether they really lend support to the conclusion and make argumentative decisions not just based on feeling, but based on whether the facts as given in the premises of the argument really do give you either a probable reason or a valid reason to accept the conclusion is true. Okay, so those are some of those types of ad populum arguments. Again, ad populum to the people. The next group, and again, these are some fallacies that the ad hominem arguments or ad hominem fallacies are specific fallacies, but again, we're still working within the broad group of fallacies called fallacies of relevance, where the reasons given for your accepting a conclusion are logically irrelevant to the truth of the conclusion. So, what these arguments do is, in some way or another, they give you a fact about the arguer rather than about the argument. Instead of considering the reasoning, they either directly attack the arguer or they make you want to associate in some way with it. So the word ad hominem literally means to man or to the person. So what you're doing is usually an ad hominem fallacy is committed when somebody assesses someone else's argument, but not always. The circumstantial ones, you're usually arguing for a conclusion yourself as a person. So they direct their force toward the opponent, not the opponent's position. So, in other words, even if the fact presented about an opponent is true, it doesn't necessarily mean that the conclusion is true. So they irrelevantly offer facts about an opponent as reasons to believe that their conclusion is true. Now, there's two broad categories of ad hominem argument. I think the easiest category are the abusive ones, where you're basically directly attacking a person who's just given an argument. And so the fallacy of relevance, because instead of directing your response to the person's actual reasoning, you're attacking the person themselves instead. And then the other group we're going to see, they're usually committed by the person who, in other words, the person who commits the fallacy is usually trying to convince someone of something. And don't worry about poisoning the well. I should take that out. It's a type that belongs in this category that Kofi discussed. Remember, this has gone through several revisions because of different texts I've used, and we used Kofi's text for years, and he discusses poisoning the well. But since Hurley, for whatever reason, doesn't, we're not going to worry about that. But circumstantial ad hominem arguments. This I thought was a good. Somehow I feel like I just recently discussed this. I don't think I did. The Disney people. Some of you know. Anybody ever visited the Manassas battlefield down there south of Washington in Manassas, Virginia? Well, at any rate, it is a place much like Gettysburg to the north of us, although it was not as big or decisive a battle as Gettysburg. Still, it's a very famous Civil War battle. And there are monuments there, and it's to some people it's hallowed ground, right? As places like Gettysburg and Antietam, sort of hallowed ground. A lot of soldiers lost their lives there, during the battle, and people would think, well, we ought to honor that ground. We don't want to dishonor their memory by doing something tacky on it. Well, so this piece of text, and I shortened it considerably to get it into the slide, because actually it was longer, but some historians had argued the case for why they thought Disney should not be putting up a theme park outside of Washington, in part on some of the ground that was part of the Manassas battle, right? And so this response was a newspaper response to their argument against Disney erecting this, but instead of addressing the reasoning that the historians gave as to why they thought it would be wrong to build a park there, instead the writer of this letter to the editor attacks the historians, right? And these are some of the things they said, you know, but their argument was basically this: historians are wrong in opposing the proposed Disney theme park to be built over Civil War battlefields. It was actually the Manassas battlefield. Then they say, hey, look, you know, these are the same people who put their students to sleep, you know, who aren't real great teachers, who are responsible for the near demise of interest in history amongst people and their students, you know, who turn off their students with volumes of literary pomp, you know, in other words, who don't even write good books. And the point is, even if those things are true, they don't have anything to do with whether or not the arguments that historians presented against, you know, against, you know, the Disney people and that theme park there were good arguments. You know, so it just attacks them, and it does it in an abusive way, right? You know, it really cuts them down, the historians. So do you see why that's a fallacious way to argue? Instead of addressing their reasoning, it's just attacking them as people. Yeah, go ahead.
Great point. How do you not be as being abusive? Basically, the person is just attacking what somebody already said, like directly attacking like an article or somebody arguing already. The person is attacking an opponent. You know, opponent is someone who already wrote something, already wrote a letter.
Yeah. Usually an abuse of that hominem argument is committed when somebody responds to someone else's reasoning. And yeah, you brought up a good point. You can either attack the person directly, or you can say very abusive things about, you know, the piece of writing, you know, it's nothing but literary tripe, you know, written on a fifth grade level, or something, you know, abusive. But that doesn't really deal with the actual reasoning that they gave. You know, so you're not really analyzing their argument and responding to it by pointing out, say, some logical flaw or some false premise in a reasoning of the historians, but instead you're attacking the people making the argument. And so it's, you know, it's an abuse of ad hominem argument. So in other words, even if these facts that this letter writer, the Baltimore Sun, are true, even if it's true that these are boring professors that turn off their students and put them to sleep, still, that's irrelevant to whether or not the reasoning they gave for not having a theme park is good reasoning or not. So that's why this is considered a fallacy of relevance. The facts about the historians themselves, even if true, are irrelevant to whether or not they gave a good argument, to whether or not their conclusion is true or not. So you see why it's fallacious. Now, a circumstantial one is different. Usually, it's a person trying to convince somebody of something, trying to make an argument themselves who commits a circumstantial ad hominem argument. But what you're doing is offering some fact. So you're talking about the person you're trying to convince, right? And you're offering some fact about their situation, about their circumstances, as a reason why they ought to accept your conclusion as true. So you're not directly attacking the person or saying something about them, but and so here's an example. And you find this, Mary, you're a Democrat. Hey, Democrats are pro-choice, so you should be pro-choice. What are you doing in the pro-life? What are you doing going through? And so, but, people think for themselves. Seldom do they buy into every plank in a, party's platform. So this is not a good argument. It says you should adopt this position vis-a-vis abortion just by your special circumstances as a member of the Democratic Party, right? And obviously most Republicans, I think, are pro-life. They're abortion. You could develop an argument on the other side. Say, hey, you're a registered Republican. How come you're, how come you're pro-choice? And there are pro-choice Republicans. Okay. So do you see how this is offering an irrelevant reason about the person's situation, their circumstances, sensible, circumstantial, as a reason to believe the conclusion you're trying to argue for is true. And so, now, this is another type, and also fits in a tu quoque. Is kind of, literally it means you're another, or you too. It's kind of like saying, hey, you do the same thing. Right? The person who commits this fallacy defends the practice by arguing that the opponent also engages in the same practice. Right? Picture a child saying to a parent, well, must be all right for you to use, must be all right for me to use that word, since I've heard you use it before. I love that thing in the Christmas story where the kid uses the F dash word, and he gets his mouth washed out with soap, and he says, and he blames it on hearing the word from one of his classmates. But he says, now I heard my father use that word at least 8 or 10 times a day for years, but, and then the kid, his classmate, gets in trouble. But the point is whether or not the parent does the same thing has nothing to do with whether or not it's a good or bad practice, right? Just to say you do the same thing too doesn't justify the practice. Okay, now I want to look at real quickly couple of examples. Here's one from the Delaware election. Where Christine O'Donnell was running but for Senate in Delaware. And this is a pretty, well, see what you think. I mean, the article says, please, no more flaky female candidates. First Palin, as in Sarah Palin, now O'Donnell, as in Christine O'Donnell in Delaware. We've suffered enough. And this was written by a woman, right? Susan Reamer wrote it September 27, 2010. Came out in the newspaper somewhere. The descendants of Christine O'Donnell, Delaware's Tea Party-backed candidate for the U.S. Senate, has women like me cringing like we haven't done since Sarah Palin arrived on the scene. Please, God. Not another ditz with baggage and a loopy belief system. Miss O'Donnell comes with a list of legitimate questions. How does she support herself? What kind of job does she have? And is it with campaign funds? Why did she mislead voters about her education? She only received her degree after paying off a 20-year-old debt to the college this summer. She has murky financial problems, including unpaid taxes and a house in foreclosure. And she comes, and here's especially where it gets very attacking, and she comes with some crazy ideas. Condoms do not prevent AIDS, and masturbation is against God's law because you can't engage in it without lust in your heart. I mean, who even goes there? And she says evolution is a soft science. The upside in her nomination is the hitches. So, and she says Karl Rove won't even support her because she says a lot of nutty things. So you see, a lot of what they're doing is attacking her as a person. So they're saying, don't even think of voting for this woman for Senate because, you know, of some facts about her personal life. So at any rate, I mean, that's an example of an abusive ad hominem argument. And we'll look at a few more next time. So just go on in the PowerPoint, you know, and so we're just going to keep on rolling through these. Take care. If you came in after I called roll, let me know that you're here, and we'll see you Wednesday. Have a good day. Let me just shut off the recording.